I'm gonna build a radio with static from the stars and broadcast at a frequency you'll pick up in your cars. I'm setting out on airwaves where we'll feel right.
Let's talk about The Great War by Joe Sacco, which was published in 2013. Now, as you probably know, Joe Sacco is best known for his comics and journalism books such as Palestine and Safe Area Garajda. So his books mostly look a little something like this, comics. But what Joe Sacco has done with The Great War is he's taken out all of the panels, he's taken out all of the text, and he's drawn a wordless battlefield scene that is 7 meters long. And this isn't just a generic war scene that Joe Sacco has drawn. He's actually depicting a particular battle. It was the first day of the Battle of the Somme that the British Empire fought against the German Empire. The scene in this book is actually a timeline of 24 hours worth of events that stretch from left to right. So we begin by seeing the British Commander Douglas Haig walking in his garden, then we see the massive mobilisation of British troops that poured out onto the battlefield. And it's interesting to see how horses were still such a major part of the military back then, being used to transport supplies out onto the battlefield besides motorised vehicles. Further to the right, we see the massive numbers of British troops marching out towards the front line as the British Howitzer cannons blast artillery towards the German positions. Then we see darkness fall as the British troops pack their way into the trenches. And I mean pack their way into the trenches. Most of the troops actually had to spend the entire night before the battle standing on their feet in a trench. On the 1st of July, when the sun rose, the British attack began at precisely 7:30 a.m. with the British troops walking across no man's land. Walking, not running, those were the orders. Walking across no man's land towards the German line and becoming just fodder for the German cannons and machine gunners to fire at. 30,000 British soldiers died within the first hour of the attack. 30,000 within an hour, with hundreds and thousands injured. You can just imagine the chaos and the sights and the sounds and the smells that were in the air that morning. This was arguably the largest battle in the history of humanity up until that point. And even though the battlefield was in France, the sound of the bombing could be heard over 260 kilometers away in London. The thing that jumps out to me when I look at the Great War is just the huge scale of human effort that goes into warfare. That's normally a hard thing for us to comprehend because we're so used to seeing isolated photographs of small groups of soldiers in a trench. But with this book, we get to see the whole sweep of the entire front line all in one continuous scene. But I think that all too often we imagine war as just consisting of merely the soldiers on the front line who are fighting each other. Joe Sacco shows us that there's much more to it than that. He shows the massive logistical efforts that are needed to transport the troops into battle. He shows all the sleeping quarters and the catering departments that need to be established in order to feed the troops, all of the medical staff needed to treat the troops, all of the military police needed to be stationed in the trenches to make sure that none of the soldiers run away in the middle of battle. And then after all the fighting is over, on the very right-hand side of the scene, Joe hints at the aftermath of combat. He shows all of the wounded soldiers whose lives are permanently scarred, who are now being treated by the medics, and he shows the people whose job it is to bury the dead bodies. It really makes you think about the senselessness of war and the enormous civilization scale effort that's needed for one country to wage war on another. And it makes me think about all of the everyday people who aren't heroes of war like we so often say. They're victims of war. They're victims of politicians who failed to solve problems through diplomatic and peaceful solutions. It really makes me think about why some people are so enthusiastic about war if this is the ultimate outcome. Joe Sacco's The Great War is a remarkable artistic creation, and by the way, I've only been showing you certain scenes from the book in this video. It really is worth getting your hands on the actual book and reading this thing yourself. The book is totally overwhelming in its scale. There's more detail than anyone can possibly fully take in, but that's the whole point. Each of us will have a different individual experience as we read this book in terms of the particular parts of the illustration that we focus on, but all of us will have an identical overall reading experience. All of us overall will see that war is just a conveyor belt to misery and obliteration. So if you want a conversation started to add to your book collection, get a hold of The Great War by Joe Sacco.